My daughter stopped talking to her imaginary friend on a Tuesday. I remember the day precisely because I had just come home from the hospital where my mother was recovering from a minor procedure, and I walked into the house to find Elena sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor, perfectly still, staring at the corner behind the refrigerator. She was 6 years old and had been talking to Mara for almost 8 months, the way children do. The harmless theater of early childhood that pediatricians and parenting books assure you is a sign of creativity, of emotional intelligence, of a healthy inner life. I set my keys on the counter and asked her what she was doing, and she turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something that was not quite fear and not quite calm, but existed in the narrow, uncomfortable space between them. She said, "Mara told me to stop talking to her. She said she doesn't want you to know she's real." I laughed, the way parents laugh at things children say, the reflex of dismissal dressed up as delight. I made dinner. I did not think about it again until the following week, when I found the drawings. Elena had been drawing since she was 3, the usual scribbles that evolve into crude figures with circular heads and stick limbs, the universal visual grammar of early childhood. What I found tucked beneath her mattress when I was changing her sheets were not those drawings. They were precise, architectural. Hallways rendered in perspective, rooms with measured proportions, staircases that descended in accurate foreshortening. At the center of every drawing stood a figure that was not quite human, not in the way the proportions worked, the arms slightly too long, the neck marginally too extended, the head tilted at an angle that suggested either curiosity or something that resembled curiosity without being it. Beneath each drawing, in Elena's handwriting but in letters more controlled than any she had produced in school, was the same word, here. I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. When she came home from school, I showed her the drawings and asked if she had made them. She looked at them the way you look at photographs from a trip you have forgotten, recognition arriving slowly, with effort. She said yes. I asked her when. She said she did not know. I asked her who had taught her to draw like that. She said Mara had guided her hand. That night, after Elena was asleep, I stood in the doorway of her room and watched her breathing in the dark, and I noticed that the corner behind her dresser, the corner diagonal to where she slept, was not as dark as it should have been. Not lighter, precisely. Simply less dark, as if the darkness there had a different quality, a different density, as if the dark in that corner was made of something other than the mere absence of light. I told myself I was tired. I told myself that grief about my mother, anxiety about work, the ordinary accumulations of adult stress were bending my perception. I closed the door and went to bed and lay awake for 3 hours listening to the house. My wife Sarah noticed it 2 days later, which is the detail that removed the possibility of self-deception. She came to me in the afternoon while Elena was at school and told me that she had been in Elena's room folding laundry when she had the powerful, physical certainty that someone was standing behind her. She turned around and the room was empty. But the temperature near the dresser, she said, was different. Not cold. She was specific about this, almost insistent. Not cold the way ghost stories describe, not the theatrical chill of the supernatural as we have been taught to imagine it. Just different. The air there had a quality of pressure, of occupation, the way the air feels in a room where someone has been standing for a long time. We did not speak the word haunting. We were educated people. We used words like strange and probably nothing and let's just watch it. I moved the dresser 2 feet to the left that evening, and Elena woke up at 2 in the morning screaming. Not the screaming of a nightmare, which I knew from years of experience, but a sustained, high, directionless sound that seemed to come from her whole body at once. When I reached her, she was sitting up in bed with her eyes open, and she said, in a voice that was her voice but arranged differently, calmly, without the texture of fear, You moved her spot. I moved the dresser back. Elena went to sleep immediately. I sat in the hallway outside her room until dawn with my back against the wall and my knees drawn up to my chest, and I thought about the drawings. I thought about here. The research I did in the following days taught me primarily that I did not know what I was looking for. I read about tulpas, about residual hauntings, about children's psychological susceptibility to manifestation of anxiety, about hypnagogia and shared delusion. None of it fit with the precision of the drawings, with the measured architectural accuracy that a 6-year-old's hand should have been physically incapable of producing. A colleague of Sarah's who studied folklore told us, over dinner, without knowing the full context of why we were asking, that in several European folk traditions there exists a category of entity that is neither malicious nor benevolent, that exists simply as presence, that attaches to children because children have not yet learned to doubt perception, and that such entities are distinguished from malevolent spirits by one specific quality. They teach, they transmit, they use the child as a means of expression rather than as a means of harm. He said this casually, between bites of food, as academic curiosity, and then the conversation moved on. I thought about it for a week. The drawings continued. Elena began leaving paper in the corner behind the dresser each night, and each morning the paper was covered in the same controlled architectural script. Always the same word repeated in varying sizes across the page. Here, here, here. One morning the word was different. I stood in Elena's room with the paper in my hands while she ate breakfast downstairs, and I read the 2 words that had replaced the single word, and I understood, with a certainty that had no rational architecture but was nonetheless absolute, that whatever was in the corner behind my daughter's dresser was not confused about its own existence, was not residual, was not a product of shared anxiety or folkloric pattern matching. It knew I had been standing in the hallway. It knew I had been watching. The 2 words were, "So are you." I worked the overnight shift at Mercy General for 11 years, and in that time I saw things that would hollow out a younger person, the kind of things you learn to file away under occupational hazard and never speak about at dinner tables. I was a floor nurse on the 4th floor, the geriatric ward, and if you have never spent a night among the very old and the very sick, then you have no frame of reference for the particular quality of silence that settles over a hospital after 2 in the morning. It is not peaceful. It is the silence of held breath, of something waiting. I noticed it my first week and spent the next decade pretending I hadn't. The ward had 22 beds arranged in 11 rooms, and on the night I am describing, we had 19 patients. I remember the number because I counted them twice before my break, which was a habit I had developed not from protocol, but from something closer to superstition. My colleague Diane was at the station when I returned with my coffee, and she looked up from her chart and said the thing she always said, which was, "Quiet tonight." And I gave the answer I always gave, which was, "Don't say that." She laughed. She went on her break at 2:30. I was alone at the station, which was standard, and the monitors were steady, and the hallway under the fluorescent lights had that particular yellow cast that makes everyone look slightly dead, which is an observation you stop finding funny after the 3rd year. At 2:47, a monitor alarmed from room 9. The patient in room 9 was a man named Gerald Foss, 81 years old, admitted for a hip replacement that had gone sideways into a pulmonary complication, and he had been stable for 4 days, which in geriatric nursing means precisely nothing. I walked to his room and I pushed open the door, and the first thing I noticed was that he was sitting up, which he had not been doing on my last check. He was sitting perfectly upright with his hands flat on the blanket, and he was staring at the corner of the room, the far corner near the window, with an expression I can only describe as polite attention, the way you look at someone who is speaking to you and whom you are trying very hard to understand. I said his name. He didn't turn. I came around the bed to check his IV line, and I glanced toward the corner because I am only human, and there was nothing there, which I registered and dismissed in the same motion, and I silenced the monitor and checked his vitals, which were strange. His heart rate was elevated, but his blood pressure had dropped, and his eyes were tracking something in the corner with the slow, deliberate movement of someone following a very slow object across a room. I put my hand on his arm and said his name again, louder, and he turned to look at me with an expression of mild surprise, as if I had interrupted something. He said, "She's been here a while." I asked who. He looked back at the corner and said, "She doesn't tell me her name. She just stands there." I documented the confusion as a possible symptom of the medication adjustment we had made that afternoon, and I paged the on-call physician, and I left the room, and I want to be honest about the fact that my hands were not entirely steady when I wrote the note. This would have been the end of it, one of those small incidents you carry home and set down and forget, except that at 3:15 I heard a sound from the hallway that I cannot accurately describe to you. It was not loud. It was not a scream or a crash or anything that would trigger a trained response. It was closer to a sound a person makes when they are very surprised by something they probably should have anticipated, a short, involuntary exhalation that functions as the space between normalcy and whatever comes after it. It came from room 11. The patient in room 11 was a woman named Adela Marsh, 77. Dementia, generally nonverbal, and she had not made a purposeful sound in the 3 weeks she had been on our ward. I went to her room and opened the door, and she was also sitting up, which Adela Marsh had not done unassisted in months, and she was also staring at the corner of her room, the same corner relative to the door, the corner near the window, and she was making a sound under her breath that was too rhythmic to be random, too quiet for me to parse into words. I stood in the doorway for longer than I should have before I went in. The corner was empty. I am telling you it was empty, and I am telling you that I stood very still and looked at it for what felt like a long time, and the corner was empty in the way that corners are, which is to say it was a junction of two walls and a floor, and it held nothing except the particular shadow that corners collect in fluorescent light. I checked Adela Marsh's vitals. Elevated heart rate. Dropped blood pressure. She was looking at the corner over my shoulder the entire time I worked. At 3:40 I walked the hall, and I checked every room, which I was not supposed to do alone without cause, and I found 4 more patients in the same state, sitting up, staring at the corner near their windows, vital signs in that identical pattern, elevated and dropped like a tide going out. 6 patients in 6 rooms doing the same thing at the same time in the same direction, and I stood in the hallway between rooms 7 and 8, and I thought about the layout of the building, which I knew well, and I realized that the corners they were all watching were not random corners. They were the corners that faced the same external wall, the wall that faced the hospital's east wing, the wing that had been closed for renovation for 8 months, the wing that sat dark and empty every night when I drove past it on my way in. I called Diane. She did not answer, which was unusual because Diane always answered, and I tried twice more, and then I called the on-call desk and got the physician, who was a tired man named Patel, who asked me to clarify what exactly I was reporting, and when I said 6 patients simultaneously presenting with elevated heart rate, hypotension, and apparent shared focal fixation on the eastern wall. There was a pause, and he said he would be up in 20 minutes. I walked back to the nurse's station, and I sat down, and I looked out the window at the east wing across the courtyard, and the east wing was dark the way it always was, every window lightless, every floor shut down, and I was looking at the 3rd floor of the east wing, which corresponded to our floor, and I was thinking about the 6 patients and their identical vital patterns when one of the windows in the east wing across the courtyard turned on. Not the overhead light, Something smaller, something moving, passing behind the glass. A handheld light the way a phone flashlight looks through a window, or the way a very small lamp looks when someone is carrying it slowly through a dark room. It moved from the left side of the window to the right side, and then it was gone and the window was dark again. I picked up the phone to call security, and I noticed that my hand had stopped being unsteady. It had gone past unsteady into a stillness that I recognized from the worst moments of my career. The code blues and the families in the hallway, and the things you do with a completely quiet body, because there is simply no other option. I called security, and a man named Torres answered, and I told him there was a light moving in the east wing on the third floor, and he said he would check it. I watched the window. The light did not come back. At 4:05, Torres called me back. He had walked the east wing. He had gone to the third floor. He had found nothing, no person, no light source, no sign of entry, nothing out of place. I thanked him and hung up, and I went back to check the 6 patients, and every one of them was lying down. Every one of them was asleep, or something that resembled sleep. Their vitals had normalized. Gerald Foss, when I looked in on him, was on his side, facing away from the corner, breathing slowly, and the monitor was steady and quiet. I documented everything clinically, and I said nothing to Diane when she came back from her break. Patel arrived at 4:30, and I told him the patients had stabilized, and he looked relieved and left without reviewing the charts. I finished my shift. I drove home in the early morning, and I parked in my driveway, and I sat in the car for a while without going inside. I have told this story twice since it happened. The first time I told it, the person listening suggested mass psychogenic response, which is a real phenomenon and a reasonable explanation, and I do not entirely disbelieve it. What I have not been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including my own, is that I was never in any of those rooms when the patients were staring at the corner. I was in the hallway. I was at the station. I was looking at the east wing window. And I never looked at the eastern corners of any of those rooms. Not once. Not deliberately. But I know with a certainty I have not been able to think my way out of in the 3 years since, that if I had looked, I would have seen the same thing they were seeing. I know this the way you know certain things that live below the reach of argument. I have worked 2 more years on that ward since then. I no longer say, "Quiet tonight," when someone says it to me. I don't laugh when they do. And I do not look at the corners near the windows after 2 in the morning. That is the only precaution I have found that feels like enough, and on most. Nights I almost believe it is. I moved into the apartment on the 3rd floor in early October, and the first thing I noticed about the building was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, the way a library is quiet, but hollow quiet, the way an empty parking garage is quiet at 2 in the morning, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I needed the change. My therapist had said a new environment would help, and I believed her because I wanted to believe someone. The apartment was cheap, the landlord was indifferent in a way I found comforting, and the windows faced east, which meant I would wake up to light instead of darkness. That mattered more to me than I was willing to admit at the time. I unpacked in one evening, ate cold noodles standing over the kitchen sink, and went to bed before 9. I slept better than I had in months. It was only later that I understood the silence had not been emptiness. It had been waiting. The man in the apartment directly above mine was named Gerald. I know his name now because I eventually looked it up, the way you look up something after the fact, to confirm what you already know in your stomach. At the time, he was only footsteps. He walked at 11:15 every night, back and forth across what I assumed was his living room for exactly 30 minutes. I know the duration because, After the third night, I started timing it. 30 minutes of slow, deliberate walking. No variation in pace, no pauses, no furniture being moved, no television, no phone call. Nothing to explain the rhythm except the rhythm itself. Then silence. I told myself insomnia. I told myself anxiety. I had plenty of both and knew how they manufactured explanations. On the fifth night, I put in earplugs, and the footsteps came through anyway, not as sound, but as a faint vibration in the mattress, a pulse, something closer to feeling than hearing, and I lay there in the dark and counted each step without meaning to. I met him for the first time in the stairwell on a Tuesday morning. He was coming down as I was going up, and we stopped on the landing between floors the way strangers do when the space is too narrow to pass without acknowledgement. He was older than I expected, maybe late 60s, with very pale skin and very careful eyes, the kind of eyes that don't move the way normal eyes move. Most people, when they look at you, let their gaze drift slightly, take in your whole face, check your expression the way we all do unconsciously. Gerald looked at a fixed point, my throat. He smiled, and I smiled back, and he said it was good to have a new neighbor, and his voice was pleasant and completely ordinary, and I went upstairs and stood in my kitchen for a while before I could remember what I had gone out to buy. That evening the walking started at 11:15, and I sat on my couch and listened and thought about his eyes, and told myself I was constructing something out of nothing, the way lonely people do, the way I specifically had always done. I was very good at talking myself out of my own instincts. Years of practice. A week later, I mentioned him to my friend Dana over the phone. She laughed and said I had always been dramatic about neighbors and asked if I was eating properly, and I said yes, and we talked about other things. But that night I put a glass of water on my nightstand and watched the surface of the water during the 30 minutes, and the water moved. Not violently, not even visibly unless you were looking for it. But there was a tremor in it, a tiny rhythmic disturbance, step by step, and I watched it until it stopped, and then I watched it for a long time after that, until the water was still and I was not. I started sleeping badly again. I started listening for the 11:15 walk, the way you listen for an alarm you know is coming, body already tensed before the sound. Some nights I got up and stood in the dark hallway of my apartment and pressed my ear to the ceiling and counted steps. 44 steps one way, 44 steps back. Always the same. I knew the path by then better than I knew my own floor plan. I could close my eyes and walk it with him. That realization came to me one night as I stood in the hallway in my socks, eyes closed, moving my weight from foot to foot in time with the steps above me, and I opened my eyes and looked at what I was doing and went back to bed and did not sleep at all. In November, I started keeping a log. I wrote down the start time and end time each night, 11:15 to 11:45, without a single exception, every night, including weekends. I wrote this in a notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer, and sometimes I would read back through the entries, and the consistency felt worse than inconsistency would have. Inconsistency would have meant a person living an ordinary life with ordinary variation. This was something else. This was maintenance. I ran into him again near the mailboxes in early December. He asked how I was settling in, and I said fine, and he said the building had good bones, which is a thing people say about old buildings. But the way he said it made me look at him, and he was looking at the wall when he said it, not at me. His fingers resting flat against the painted concrete, like he was feeling for something. I said I had to go, and he said of course, and smiled at the wall. I took my mail upstairs and sat on the floor of my hallway and opened none of it. The night I found the marks was in the second week of December. I had been sitting in my living room after midnight, unable to sleep, when I noticed that the ceiling above my couch had a series of faint grooves in the plaster. I had not noticed them before because I had never looked at that part of the ceiling in direct lamplight at that angle. I got a chair and stood on it and looked more closely. They were not cracks. They were too regular for cracks, too deliberate. A set of parallel lines scored into the plaster with something thin and hard, grouped in fours with a fifth line crossing through them, the way prisoners count days in films. I counted the groups. I counted them again. There were 31 groups. I stepped down from the chair and stood in the middle of my living room and thought about what 31 could mean. 31 nights, 31 tenants. 31 of something I did not want to finish thinking about. I told myself the previous tenant had done it as a joke, or out of boredom, or as part of something I had no context for, and therefore no reason to fear. I was very practiced at this. I went to bed. The walking started at 11:15. I called my landlord the next morning and asked how long the previous tenant had lived in the apartment, and there was a pause before he said he didn't have that information readily available, and I said could he find it, and he said he would look into it. He never called back. I stopped waiting for him to call back after 2 days and started making other plans. I started sleeping on the couch closest to the door. I started leaving a lamp on. I started checking the lock 3 times each night instead of once. None of these things changed the walking, or the 30-minute duration, or the sound of Gerald's feet crossing my ceiling in the dark, back and forth, 44 steps and 44 steps back, patient and exact, as though he were measuring something, as though he had been measuring it for a very long time and was not yet finished. The last night I spent in that apartment was a Thursday. I woke at 3 in the morning to silence, which should have been a relief and was not, because the silence felt different from the normal silence after 11:45. It felt occupied. I lay still and listened and heard, from directly above my head, not footsteps but something lower, a slow dragging sound, deliberate, moving from one side of the room to the other, once, then nothing. I got up, dressed in the dark without turning on any lights, took only what was already in my bag, and left. I walked down the stairwell and out the front door and did not look at the mailboxes or the ceiling or the building behind me as I walked away. I called Dana from the street at 3:20 in the morning and she answered, which is the thing I am most grateful for, and I told her I needed somewhere to stay, and she said, "Come now." And I did. I never went back for the rest of my things. I let the landlord keep the deposit. Some costs are not really about money, and some silences are not really about quiet, and some things that walk in the dark above you are not doing it because they cannot sleep.